Gary Webb, the late Gary Webb, who wrote for the San Jose Mercury News and in the middle 90s about the complicity of the CIA in the importation of cocaine into this country. And Webb, of course, did this famous series in the San Jose Mercury News in the middle 90s. The big fuss had been in the late 80s about this. There'd been hearings conducted by Senator John Kerry on it. By the late 90s, it was kind of a semi-forgotten story, the shuttle of arms and cocaine. And, of course, ultimately it exploded with the Iran-Contra scandal in the late 80s, which was very discomforting to the Reagan administration. Well, Webb produced this journalism, and then it wasn't going anywhere, but then black radio took it up, and they were saying, here are our inner-city neighborhoods completely trashed out by crack cocaine, and it turns out the CIA was involved. At that point, I think it was seen as destabilizing to the system. One of the points we make in the book is that the mainstream press is very protective, of course, and part of the corporate system, the political system. And they went after Webb. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, conspicuously. And they trashed him viciously and unfairly, and drove him from his job. And in a way, ultimately, it's what I think drove him to his death, because he finally killed himself. Yeah. A very tragic story. But, of course, it turned out, when you look at the CIA Inspector General's reports, which we detail, in this book we quote from them, that Webb was right. Webb got it right. The mainstream press got it wrong. And then the last bit of the book, just to finish on the book, is we call it Counterpunch's side of the story. This is journalism that we think, great stuff that we did, which the mainstream press didn't get. Because we think now this is a time of real opportunity. The table has been leveled. When I came to America, you know, these vast newspaper combines, the New York Times, you put it on the scale today, and what does it weigh, 5 pounds or something? But on the internet, you know, it's as high as your laptop screen, same as Counterpunch. So the playing field has been leveled in a way. I may not go on being leveled, but this is a time, you know, the left is always kind of down in the mouth and depressed about things, generally pessimistic. We say, don't be so pessimistic. Counterpunch reaches a huge audience. We have like 3 million hits a day. We have 100,000 unique viewers a day. It's big stuff.
In fact, you write a lot about optimism and the need for optimism. I
tend to be a bushy-tailed. I mean, I don't think you can persuade people of much if you're always down in the mouth. If you're always saying there's fascism's around. The left has a terrible propensity to say, you know, fascism's around the corner. It's all getting worse and worse. Well, I mean, yes, you know, the present regime has trashed the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, there's the Patriot Act, and all that stuff. There's plenty to complain about. But, you know, you never get too far just by whining. People don't like whiners. I don't like whiners.
You call Rupert Murdoch in this book a world-scale monster. Why?
I think every word carries its weight and does its duty. I mean, first of all, he's world-scale. I knew Murdoch a little bit when he had briefly held The Voice. I mean, he's a ruthless fellow. He's a predator, so to speak, at every level. I think his force in the world has been malign. I mean, he's a sort of coagulated blob of prejudice and spleen. I don't know, from day one. I mean, he stands for a posture in the world which is negative. He's raised the vulgarity level in this country very considerably. In England, it's a nightmare, you know. I mean, I don't see how anyone could live within sonic range or visual range of a Murdoch product in England. I mean, it's like having a sort of, you know, having to carry some huge bag of sewage changed to your foot. I mean, the English papers are pretty impossible anyway, but, and here, you know, his presence, I think, is almost uniformly negative and has been negative. If you compare him even to someone like William Randolph Hearst in an earlier era, and Hearst was no angel. He was in many ways a terrible thug, but I think it was a slightly more, if you had to balance the two, I think the scales would tilt in favor of Hearst very easily.
Well, continuing on your
I'll make one more point about Murdoch.
Oh, okay.
I think he hawks his political services through his media to the political power that he sees as providing him with commercial and political advantage. It's a point that was very well made in a book by a friend of mine, Bruce Page, published in England, about Murdoch. You know, so he goes with Thatcher, he goes with Blair, it was with Bush. If he sees that a Democrat's going to win, you know, then his papers, you know, whoever it might be, you know, Clinton, Hillary Clinton, I think he was in favor of her being the Democratic nominee. The bargains are always ahead.
Continuing your imagery of sewage, you call journalism schools in this book feedlots of mediocrity.
Feedlots of mediocrity. Well chosen phrase. I think the point about J schools, I think, and often I noticed if you go to a campus where there's a J school, the campus newspaper is very often not so good. Why? Because the kids are all already writing for their future employees, their clips, you know, I think very often written so that then they'll hand them to the hiring editor at the New York Times or one of the big papers, although this is going to be changing, to show that they're already respectable, you know, balance and all, you know, everything, and you're not too far out, not radical. And so it's essentially a process of selection. I mean, when I went into journalism, you know, went to a paper, there were still a lot of sort of, it was a more bohemian outfit. You know, you had strange people who'd come into journalism late. But now it's credentialed. You go into a newspaper office now, it's like going into an insurance office, you know, solemnly change in front of their things. They're very respectable people. And it's way too and the J school's got a lot to do with that. I mean, I don't know what they learn in these J schools for 2 years. I mean, how to build a story and how to do this and how to do that. I mean, I've certainly, you know, tried to help people get into these various grad schools. But I always wag my finger at them and tell them, why don't you just go around the world and settle in some country that's, you know, they say, how can I get ahead? And I say, well, settle in a country where there's going to be a war in about 3 years, which, you know, you can set your watch by how many wars there are. You know, they go on. And then suddenly you'll be the stringer. Now the newspapers, or the radio, they're desperate to have expertise from wherever it is. It's how my brother Patrick got going in Lebanon in the middle 70s. You know, suddenly he was the guy. You know, he didn't have to, like, parachute in a new person.
Is this the brother that's currently in Iraq?
Yeah, he's been in Iraq probably more than anybody else practically.
Continuing with the journalism, I want to read back to you something that you wrote recently, really concerning about the current war. You say, sometimes I dream of them. Friedman, I mean Tom Friedman, Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, and Berman. Who's Berman?
Paul Berman.
Oh, Paul Berman. Like characters in a Beckett play, buried up to their necks in a rubbish dump on the edge of Baghdad, reciting their columns to each other as the local women turn over the corpses to see if one of them is her husband or her son.
Yeah, I wrote that last week, actually, just after the anniversary of the war. And I went back, and I don't have to go back because I can remember it well enough, but all these people who made all these predictions and encouragements in the journalism area for the war, like starting with Friedman, you know, one of the most pompous people on the planet, who has got, what, 3 Pulitzer Prizes? I mean, oh, what a disgrace to the profession. You can call it that. They should decorate this nitwit with 3 Pulitzers. And then Hitchens, of course, was totally pro-war and a cheerleader for the war, still says he thought it was, you know, he was right to have said that. Went to the Bush White House right before the outbreak of the war in the spring of 2003 to give a sort of, you know, pep talk. This is a journalist, you know, on board totally. And then Berman, well, he's not so interesting, but and there are others. And when you look at how wrong they were about everything, but then you see, and the piece that you quote from, I quote a lot of my brother's stuff. Now, Patrick has really been in Iraq probably more than any other journalist. As a non-embedded journalist, he's gone over Iraq. He's pointed out constantly that a lot cannot be reported now because it is too lethally dangerous. But he goes on these roads, and he's, you know, he's very experienced. And he says, when you look at this absolutely shattered country, you know, where 5,000–6,000 people a month are being slaughtered in these, you know, well, in the war by the various forces, the factionalism, just blown up, destroyed. You've got, of course, the troops over there, many of them, you know, forced to stay on the stop-loss business, coming back dead, and of their bodies coming back or coming back maimed. There'll be psychic and physical wreckage in America for years to come because, you know, there's a percentage that have PTSD and, you know, and all the problems associated with that. And you just think, I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein. I think he was a monster. I think he, you know, he got his, I think I say in that piece, you know, he destroyed his country, and then basically the United States, by that invasion, carried it off to the morgue. I mean, plundering it while it did so for the oil and the rest of it. It's an absolute disaster. You can go from bad, which is what Iraq was. I mean, partially destroyed by the Clinton-era sanctions, by the way, which people constantly forget. The liberals are all on board for sanctions, although they... And then you've got from 2003 to 2007, this country's gone, and people's lives irretrievably. I mean, millions of lives destroyed. It would have been better if they'd not gone in. So I said I'd like these people to be in Baghdad, you know, having to answer a few very serious questions from these poor women and family people constantly searching for, you know, their wrong. So I think I say at the end of that piece, it was the people accused of being the hard left, or the left, and also the libertarians. We should not forget the libertarians, people like on antiwar.com, you know, who were against the war, clearly, and said this is a terrible idea.
Some people are very vocal against you. In fact, some of your old colleagues. Eric Alterman said, if Alexander Cockburn weren't published in The Nation, he would be considered a crank beyond the limits of intelligent discourse. Norman Podhoretz said,